What's up, everybody? Axe Wizard here. It's currently 1:16 a.m. in the morning. I've been working on my game. I did a few things here, but let me just jump in and show you what I've got. Just a few minor tweaks. So probably the biggest thing I did was I tweaked the carrier and the fighter AI. So you can see we've got our fighters deploying ships. They were doing that before. And now they are pursuing a ship. And then the fighters will return to the carrier once the combat is done. And the carrier is waiting for the fighters to be returned. Now, I still have to fix this thing where they just fly around in circles. He'll eventually get it. It's on my list. Come on, little buddy. You can do it. There you go. And then the carrier will just continue on and go about its business. The other big change that I implemented is that turrets now have turn speed. So last devlog, I was noticing during the combat that, especially with laser turrets, that let me just go down to the combat testing system here. Laser turrets, it was impossible to miss because they would just snap to your position, they would just drill you. But now laser turrets are slightly mitigated, so you can it's a lot more balanced. So turrets have a turn speed now. The standard projectile turrets, since those have a greater chance to miss, I gave them faster rotation speed, and then since the lasers can't miss, I gave them a slower rotation speed. So you can see right here, this turret is like facing somebody. And once it gets a new target, there you go. See how it's slowly rotating? And if the ship goes through it, yeah, there you go. See, it's rotating to catch up. There you go. I also made it so that ships won't stack on top of each other anymore. So you'll see all these ships flying around, and as the battle progresses, you're going to see tons of fighters flying around, and they're no longer going to stack on top of each other. It's just going to be they're going to spread out. So you see this group of fighters here, like they're not on top of each other. They're trying to spread themselves out. So that's working fairly well. So there, you can see this ship is like moving itself as well. Let's go find some more chaos here. What's going on? So let's take a look at this Crusader ship here. So you can see we've got some turrets on here. They're just drilling people. And I also made it so that the turrets won't fire unless they're actually aiming at the enemy. So we got that working too. Looks like there's a lot going on here. I also made some balance changes. Like I found out that the Synthocracy flagship was super underpowered in terms of hull integrity. So I cranked that up, and now it seems like I've been sitting here playing this like a bunch, just watching this combat happen, and it seems like Synthocracy and the Coalition seem to trade off, and it's a pretty even match so far, so I'm liking it. Coalition has just much more offense oriented, and then Synthocracy has a lot more defense and stuff like that, so their ships are definitely usually a bit beefier, more shields, more hull, but Coalition usually has a lot more weapons. So what's going on over here? Looks like there's a little bit going on. Usually there's like a one big pitched battle, but this time it's all kind of spread out, which is pretty neat. So we've got some Coalition here. So you see these turrets that are slowly rotating to keep cracking enemies. There we go. Cool. So the turrets are no longer overpowered, I think. They're still useful, so I didn't nerf them like to the ground to where they're not useful at all. But they're definitely not as... Because before it was kind of like, why even have other weapons if you could just have turrets? Because they're so accurate, you don't even have to aim. But now, the turrets, because they have to rotate, they're still just as accurate, but they may not be firing all the time, especially if you're just maneuvering around a ship. You can potentially do some cool maneuvers and dodge their turrets. So that's a cool idea. Yeah, I think now that one faction's not so dominant anymore, we're not seeing those really huge battles anymore. But it looks like we have a nice synthocracy pack over here. And then we've got some... Okay, looks like synthocracy is in charge right now, at least in this pack over here. There's still quite a few fighters flying around. I also made a change that when a carrier goes to flee, to run away, all of its deployed fighters also run away too. So there shouldn't be any more orphan fighters just flying around. So for example, all these fighters right here, if its carrier decided to go away, they would all start running away too. Yeah, I think synthocracy is dominating this one. It's cool, but you can see that as they're all flying around, they're no longer stacked anymore. So they're kind of like using their strafe action to shift themselves away. So you can see their boosters kind of firing on the side that they're trying to like shuffle themselves around. That way they're not stacking on top of each other. It's a very slight movement that looks natural, and it's not as sudden as like directly translating the coordinates to make them not collide anymore, because that's not what I want. I want them to just try to spread themselves apart, but if they need to stack, then just stack. But for the most part, this is keeping it very well. So you see all these fighters here, like they're kind of bobbing and weaving and flying around, and they're still heading towards their target, but they're not sacrificing maneuverability for that. So I think that's a very elegant solution that works out pretty well. Woo, there is. Oh, here we go. We got some coalition flash ships over here. Might have a little bit of combat going on. Okay. Coalition might be making a comeback. Yeah, man. I've just been having a blast just doing this testing, this combat testing here, and this shit's not gonna make it. Oh, I did. Nice. Yeah, I've just been having fun just flying around watching combat, and I'm also kind of stress testing it to see, when does my frame rate start kind of bogging down. I don't have an FPS tracker on here, but I can definitely tell when it starts getting choppy, and it doesn't start getting choppy until I have hundreds of ships on the screen, which is pretty cool, because I've got lots of, logic that could be optimized. So lots of running loops and things like that for every ship, every projectile even. So the fact that it can handle that is pretty darn good. So it looks like that Synthocracy is still the dominant force, but Coalition is still a thorn in their side for sure. Those fighters are taking out some of their carriers, which is really cool. Okay, what's going on over here? We got lots of people coming down here. Oh yeah, Synthocracy is still dominating. That's funny. But yeah, I think those few subtle changes make it way better. So, carriers, it's not really relevant here, but once, say for example, if this battle was won, all the deployed fighters would return to their carriers, and then they would go about their business. The fact that ships don't stack up on each other anymore really gives you some ideas to the scale of the battle. So that's really nice as well. And the fact that the turrets can't instantly just target you makes combat, I think, a lot more involved. So if you were the type to get, say, a really cool fighter like this Tomahawk here, you could potentially outmaneuver some capital ships and actually take them out on your own. The AI is kind of dumb, they just kind of fly around right now. I haven't really done any fighter AI yet, but that's on my list of stuff to do. look at this. I mean, these little drone ships are just melting this guy. And they got their turrets that keep trying to track them, but because like they keep like maneuvering super quick, it's super difficult for it, which is cool. There you go. Nice. Yeah, I'm surprised at how evenly matched this is now. Like, it seems to me like Symbocracy is still winning, but I don't think that they're winning by much right now. Like, they've got a few capital ships, but the coalition has so many just fighter-heavy ships that mostly get ignored except for turrets. They're actually doing some real damage to all their cruisers and capital ships, which is cool. But yeah, we've got a few more carriers going here. What's going on down here? It looks like there's something going on over here. Some coalition ships. Okay, so yeah, there's still some pockets of coalition resistance in the system. This is great. But yeah, anyway, that's what I wanted to show you. That's what I've been working on. I think it's coming along nicely. There's still quite a few different things I want to do in regards to combat. Like, I don't think it's anywhere near done. I want to add different attack patterns for fighters. So sometimes they might strafe through, sometimes they might try to like rotate and like orbit around you. So I think that would be really cool too, to add some of that diversity there. But it's coming along nicely. Anyway, let's jump into the code review portion. Tweaks to carriers and fighters. Let's talk about that. So spawn fighters now use their carrier's velocity and rotation. So that's a very small change. Before, when a carrier would deploy a fighter, the fighter would just be there. So say if like the carrier is moving and then it deploys a fighter, the fighter gets like, it's almost like it just gets dropped and then the fighter starts going on its own. Well, now the fighter will be facing the same direction as the carrier, and it will also have the same velocity as the carrier as well. So that just looks a little more natural. It's not something that was like a really huge change, but I just did that in ship, in my deploy fighter. All I'm doing is I'm just setting the rotation and I'm setting the velocity. I have it to do here. Maybe I might want to make them like fly out from the sides. So, you know, your carrier will be like deploying fighters from like either side of the ship and just launching them out. That could be cool. I just put a to-do there to think about it. I also fixed a bug with spawn fighter enemies. There was a list initialization problem. So what was happening is that when a carrier deploys a fighter, it was basically copying the carrier's enemy list. But what that meant is that if you were fighting a carrier, its fighters were coming at you, but they weren't showing as enemies. So your turrets weren't targeting them until they actually hit you. So that was a bit odd. So I fixed that. Let me see what I did there. So all I did there is I'm just going through all of the enemies that the carrier has. And so let's see here. E and enemies. Yeah, so I'm going through all the carrier's enemies. And then I'm ensuring that the enemy still exists. If it doesn't, I'm skipping to the next iteration. And then I'm just making sure that it's a reciprocal action where we're adding each other to each other's enemy list. So that's what we're doing there. Again, small change, but easy bug fix. So did that. Deployed fighters will return to carriers when not fighting. So this is a bit of a bigger change. Let me go down here. So let's go to AI state idle. So this is where, like, this is the default state for all the ships. This is where, like, if your ship is not sure what to do, I always set it to go back to idle, because this is where we go through our decision making process. We're resetting all of our inputs. We're checking if we have a target, if that target still exists. If we don't have a target, we're trying to find a target. And then, you know, depending on what ship class we are, we might prioritize different targets. So fighters like to tackle bigger ships. So they like freighters, cruisers, carriers. Cruisers and carriers only like to target cruisers and carriers. They're more combat ships, so they will ignore freighters and they will ignore fighters unless they're the only things on the map. So typically cruisers and carriers will fight fighters with just their turrets. They're going to focus on the bigger ships. So we've got all that logic there, determining logics and you know, determining you know, how close are they? Are we close enough to engage them now? Should we get closer and intercept them? So that's what that is. And then yeah, so after we're doing our whole target searching thing, we're just double checking to make sure we have a target. And then here we are, I'm saying, hey, if we are a carrier and we have deployed fighters, I'm just checking the array size. I'm going to set the carrier state to await deployed fighters. Now, if it's not a carrier, what we're doing here is, if we're not a carrier and we don't have a target, then what is our current objective? So I created an objective called objective deployed fighter. And if we get to this state here, what we're going to do is we're a fighter that was deployed from a carrier. Does our carrier still exist? If the carrier doesn't exist, then the fighter's just going to go hyperspace. So I changed their objective to hyperspace. If the carrier is still valid, I created a new state called state return to carrier. So that is handled by this function, AI state return to carrier. So again, we're always just making sure that the carrier is still a valid instance. If it's not, we're just returning back to idle state, which will determine what to do. And then from there, we're just making sure that we are facing our ship, and then we're going to go fly at it. And then once we are within 200 pixels, because that seems to be about a really easy distance, we're going to clear ourselves from the carrier's deployed fighters array. We're going to play the sound of our fighter being returned using our audio manager that we made. That way, once we destroy ourselves, it doesn't also stop the audio. So, yeah, so we are destroying ourselves, and then that is basically the fighter returning to the carrier. So, and the rest of this is just, you know, we're not close enough yet. Accelerate. If you're not, yeah, if you're not facing the ship, you should probably get on that. So I might reduce this down. So that's the fighter logic. And then for the carrier logic, all we're doing is we're just slowing down, and we're literally just waiting for all of our deployed fighters to return. Now, there is a chance that you may have deployed a fighter and it gets destroyed. So what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, for D and deployed fighters, we're just making sure if that instance is valid. If it's no longer valid, we're just adding it to this to be removed array. I'm doing this because I don't want to mutate an array that I'm in the process of iterating through. I think that's just how you get in trouble. I think Godot might be able to handle it, but just to be safe, I don't want to do that. So it says, now that we're not iterating through it, remove invalid entries. So once I do my read operation, then I'm going through and I'm doing my delete operations for that. And then after we do all that, we're checking that. We're just saying, hey, have all of our deployed fighters been accounted for? So if our deployed fighter size is less than 0 or less than or equal to 0, which it should never be less than, but I don't know. I like to just cover all bases here. We have no deployed fighters. We may continue. So we're setting our state back to idle, in which case the ship will go back to doing what it was doing before it came into combat. But that's that little small change there. So we talked about deployed fighters will return to carriers when not fighting. And carriers will wait for deployed fighters to return. We talked about that. We talked about, I mentioned if a carrier is going to flee, all deployed fighters will flee too. Let's talk about the logic that handles that. So I moved that. I moved all the logic that determines when a ship is going to run away. I just moved that into my AI state control. So I moved it up towards the top here. So I'm saying, hey, if our state equals idle or intercept or attack, because those are the only 3 states currently that I want to be concerned about that, then if our hit point is, you know, doesn't equal 0, because you can't divide by 0, and our percentage is less than 50, then we want to run. So I'm setting state retreat, and then I'm saying, hey, if we're a carrier, our deployed fighters should also retreat. So if a ship is not a carrier, the deployed fighters array is going to be empty. So I'm just iterating through deployed fighters. If any fighters exist, we are going to set their state to also be retreat. So that was that change there. Very small change, but I think it makes a world of difference. I was debating on what I wanted those to do, because like I was thinking, you know, if a fighter gets injured, it should probably try to return to the carrier, but it's probably going to get destroyed. So the fighters will currently just try to hyperspace out, just like any other ship. If a carrier gets like wounded, like damaged, and it goes to retreat, it will fly out and it will tell all of its deployed ships to fly out. So I think that's a pretty good solution. I might tweak that later, but that's what we got right now. Next kind of bigger change is turret weapons now have a turn speed and won't fire unless aimed. So let's go look at my weapon code. Weapon. So I have this function called handle independent weapon here, and this is what handles all the turrets. So the logic here is a lot of this is the same as before, but I just modified some things. So I'm just going to go through the whole thing as a whole, that we have context. So again, we're always since the independent weapon is going to find its own targets, I have a function called find nearest enemy, and that's just determining where the nearest enemy is. Like it's actually selecting the nearest enemy. And then we're just, again, checking if we found one. If we didn't find anything, we're just going to return. So we won't execute any code after this if we don't have a target. If we do have a target, ensure that we're aiming at it. So I just made a little aimed variable here that's a Boolean flag. True or false, and that determines whether or not it's going to actually shoot at it. So I have logic here that determines if we should try to predict the target location. So if we have that option enabled and our projectile type is actually a projectile, not a beam, then we are going to try to predict the target position. I have this function called rotate independent weapon, which just let's go take a look at it. Rotate independent weapon. So this just uses a lot of the same turn logic I've done for my ships. And I just sort of copied, pasted it, and just tweaked it to work for this. So it's just determining the shortest angle. Like it determines whether it needs to turn left or right, you know, to aim at the target. So it's just doing that, and it's the same code that you've probably seen like 40 times now if you've watched these devlogs. So I won't get into that, but it's just this one does something slightly different. It returns a Boolean though. So in my little comment here, helper function to handle determining independent weapon rotation also returns whether or not we're actually aimed at the target. So in my handle independent weapon code here, I'm setting aimed to equal whatever that rotate independent weapon gives us. So that takes in the delta, which is the time elapsed since last frame, and then it takes in a vector 2, which is the global position of where we want to actually fire at. So if we're predicting where that target's going to be, we're using our predict target position, which returns a vector 2. If we're not, we're going to aim directly at the target in case, you know, for example, we are a beam weapon. There is no predicting where the target is. You just aim at the target and then your beam instantly hits it because it's a beam. So cool. So we're just setting that directly to target global position. So if we are not aimed, which is like within, I think, 5 degrees, we're not going to shoot. So I think that works fairly well. It seemed to work pretty well in the combat. I didn't see like a lot of sputtering beams and stuff like that, and the weapon seemed to fire, and so I think it's fine. So then this is a lot of previous logic. The only thing I added here was if aimed. So just another check, and then this is checking if it's in range, and if our ship is no longer valid, but somehow we are. This should never happen, but I could probably get rid of this check, but whatever. And then we're just firing our weapon. So that's all we're doing there. So yeah, turret weapons now have a turn speed and won't fire unless aimed. Did I even talk about turn speed? Where did I? Oh yeah, there's a rotate independent weapon. That's the whole thing that does the turn speed. So yeah, I set a turn speed variable on the weapons. So I have on the beams, I have a slower turn speed, and then on the lighter weapons, I have a faster turn speed, and then for like the really bigger turrets, I have a slower turn speed. So I think those work out pretty well. And then the last thing I did was, I think this is probably the biggest change of them all. Ships no longer stack on one another. So let's go back to my ship code. And where did I put that? So let's go look at how I implemented that. So I had to make 2 new variables. So I made one called collision mask. That's just the area 2D. And this, I have a comment here that says this will be set and ready so that we can connect signals. And then I have an array of colliding ships, because my logic is that I didn't want to do it for like the first ship that it detects that you're colliding. I want it to take in a totality of it. So if you have like 50 ships on top of each other, you want to account for all of those. So what I'm doing is I'm basically saying, hey, if there's 30 on my left side and 20 on my right, I'm going to move over to the right because there's less traffic there. And so that way the ships will kind of slowly spread themselves out. So what I did here is in my ready function, which is called when the node enters the scene tree for the first time, I'm just getting that area 2D because every ship has a area 2D. And then I am connecting the signals area entered and area exited. And I just have these functions called add ship to colliding ships and remove ship from colliding ships. So what those do, let's go to add ships. So this is just verifying that that it is a ship that is being collided with. So what we're doing here is, does the area have an owner? Because I have some area 2Ds that don't have an owner. If you're not familiar with what owner means, I'll just show you really quick here. If we go look at one of my ships, not sound ships. So for example, like this coalition arrowhead here. So right here, this is where the area 2D is. If I call area 2D.owner, it's going to refer to whoever the root node of this scene is. So since this ship is a scene, this owner's going to reference the actual ship class that I made here. So that's what I want. So we're just saying, hey, is the instance valid area.owner? So if they don't have an owner, it's not a valid instance, we're not going to do anything. So we have a valid owner, but is it a ship? Now, because of how Godot works, we can't simply check if the area owner is of type ship, because that would create a cyclical reference and Godot won't allow it. So because I'm writing code in my ship class right now, I can't say, hey, if area owner is ship, it won't let me do that. So what I have to do is I'm going to check for the presence of a variable that only a ship should have. In this case, I'm using the ship class variable. So I found on a quick Google search, you can do if ship class in area owner, and that will tell you if that node you're trying to access has that variable. So if it does, we have a ship. We're going to append it to our colliding ships. So cool. And then I have this this other function that removes the ship from colliding ships. This is called with when the area exited signal fires. And here I just have a note that says we're using the erase method, which will remove it from the array if it exists and do nothing if it doesn't. So again, I'm always just verifying if the instance is valid before I try to do any changes to it. So colliding ships erase area owner. So there you go, getting rid of it. And let's see here. So now we have a function called handle ship collisions, which I have running in my process event. So if you go up here to process, I think I put that, I might have put that in my AI control. Yeah, so at the bottom of my AI control. Ensure we're not stacking on other ships. We want to ignore this if we're using the standard move state though. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, if state doesn't equal state move, because what was happening is it was preventing ships from going on planets because they're meant to stack on there. So if they're moving to a planet, I don't want them to worry about collisions. If they're intercepting and stuff like that, or trying to run away or whatever, then they can worry about that. So I just have this handle ship collisions function. And if we take a look at this, all we're doing is saying, hey, do we have any ships to actually collide with that we're colliding with? So I'm just checking the size of my colliding ships array. If it's 0, then we're doing nothing. So I'm just setting my strafe actions to be false, and I'm just returning early. We have one or more ships that we are colliding with. We'll want to keep track of how many ships are on each side and move away from the greater amount. So I just have two variables, left count and right count. It's a pretty simple, brutal way of doing it, I guess. So there's probably more elegant ways, but this works. And then I don't want to mutate my array while I'm iterating through it, so I have a to be removed array. And now I'm iterating through every one of my colliding ships. And first things first, I'm verifying if the instance is still valid, because, you know, ships blow up. If it's not a valid instance, I'm appending it to my to be removed array and then skipping to the next iteration. So instance is valid, determine which side of us it is on. To do this, we'll determine the relative angle to the colliding ship's position. So what I'm doing here is I'm just using this get angle to function, which similar to my ship code and my turret code, it's just getting the shortest angle that it needs to rotate in order to like reach somewhere. So it's getting that total angle. So the cool thing about that is that angle that it returns can be positive or negative. If it's a positive angle, that means that we have to rotate to the right or clockwise. If it is negative, that means we need to rotate to the left or counterclockwise. So if it's to our right, that means that we are going to increment right count or increment left count. And then we're going to clean up any colliding ships that don't exist anymore by erasing those entries. And then we're going to determine which side has the most ships. So if the left side has more ships, we're going to move to the right. So I'm setting my action strafe left to be false and strafe right to be true. And doing the opposite for left count and right count. If both sides are even, do nothing. If they're perfectly stacked, which is rare, they're going to be moving around and doing something. They'll eventually move around, so they'll eventually get to where they're not on top of each other, and then they can start moving away from each other. But that was how I did that there. It's probably a bit convoluted. There's probably a simpler way of doing it, but that's the way that I implemented it because that's how I wanted to make it work, and I think it works pretty well. But yeah, that's what I got. A small update, nothing really too big, fancy or showy, I suppose. But I'm making progress on it. Life's been hectic lately, so you know, it's Memorial Day weekend, and I took some time to just dig into the game, and now I'm gonna go to bed. So thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it, and I'll see you in whatever video I make next.